Sometimes the hardest thing in life is not knowing where you truly belong. For Elliot, a single father who had lost more than most men could bear, that feeling followed him everywhere until he bought a small mountain cabin, hoping to finally find peace. The cabin was old and broken down, with one window boarded shut from the inside. When he pried those boards loose, light flooded in. What he saw through that window made his breath catch. Down in the valley sat the ruins of another cabin with a rusted weather vane turning slowly in the wind. It was the same weather vane his father had built on their family farm decades ago. Was it here? What had his family hidden on this mountain? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elliot had never been a man who believed in fresh starts. At 42, he'd learned that life didn't work that way. You carried your past with you wherever you went, like stones in your pockets, weighing you down with every step. But when the inheritance check arrived, a modest sum from his mother's estate, barely enough to matter in the grand scheme of things, he'd done something impulsive. He'd bought the cabin. It wasn't much to look at. The real estate listing had been honest about that, at least. Rustic mountain retreat, needs work, cash only. The photos showed a small structure with weathered siding, a sagging porch, and windows that looked like they hadn't been opened in years. 160 acres of forest and stone, perched high in the Cascade Range, 3 hours from the small Oregon town where he'd been living since his wife died. The drive up had taken most of a day. Late October meant the roads were still passable, but snow would come soon. The realtor had warned him about that, about the isolation, about the lack of cell service, and the nearest town being 40 minutes down a winding mountain road. Elliot had nodded through all of it, signed the papers, and taken the keys. He needed the silence. That's what he'd told his sister Audrey when she'd called, her voice tight with worry. "You're running away," she'd said. "Maybe," he'd admitted. "Or maybe I'm just trying to find a place where I can hear myself think." Sophie, his 10-year-old daughter, had stayed with Audrey for the first week. It was better that way, Elliot told himself. He needed to make the place livable before she came up. Needed to fix the broken steps, patch the roof, get the old wood stove working. Needed to prove to himself that this wasn't just another mistake in a long line of them. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. Behind it, the mountain rose steep and severe. In front, the land dropped away into a valley so deep you couldn't see the bottom when the morning mist rolled in. The air smelled of pine needles and wood smoke from his own fire, and at night the silence was so complete it felt like being underwater. Elliot was a carpenter by trade, had been for 20 years. His hands knew wood the way some men knew books or music. He could look at a joint and see where it would fail, could feel the grain of a board and know if it would hold. The cabin's bones were good. Solid timber frame, tight corners, a foundation that had settled but not cracked. Someone had built this place to last. He spent the first 3 days just cleaning. Years of dust and mouse droppings, spiderwebs thick as curtains in the corners, a smell of dampness and decay that clung to everything. He scrubbed the floors on his hands and knees, washed the windows until they were clear enough to see through, hauled out bags of debris and old furniture that had rotted beyond saving. The wood stove took longer. The chimney was clogged with bird nests and creosote, dangerous if he tried to light a fire without clearing it. He spent a whole afternoon on the roof with a brush and rope, feeling the bite of cold wind on his face, looking out at the endless forest stretching in every direction. Up here, it was easy to forget the world below existed at all. By the 4th day, he had the place warm. The stove glowed with heat, and he'd hung canvas tarps over the windows to keep the drafts out. He'd brought supplies, canned goods, coffee, batteries for the lanterns. His truck was parked in the clearing, but he found himself using it less and less. Where was there to go? At night, he lay in the sleeping bag he'd spread on the cabin's only bed frame and thought about his wife. 3 years gone, and some days it felt like yesterday. Of the days, he could barely remember her face without looking at photographs. The grief had changed, he realized. It wasn't the sharp, cutting thing it had been at first. Now it was more like a low hum in his chest, always there, easy to ignore, until something reminded him. A song on the radio, the smell of her perfume on a stranger, the way Sophie laughed exactly like her mother. He'd been a good husband, he thought. Present, faithful, steady, but he hadn't been enough to keep her alive. Cancer didn't care about love or good intentions. It took what it wanted and left behind wreckage. Sophie needed him to be strong. He knew that. She was only 7 when her mother died, too young to understand why the woman who tucked her in at night simply stopped coming home from the hospital. For 3 years, Elliot had tried to be both parents, tried to fill the emptiness with routine and presence and all the love he had left. But he was tired. Bone tired. Soul tired. That's why he'd bought the cabin. Not to run away from Sophie, but to find enough peace that he could go back to her whole. Gerald, his oldest friend, had understood. They'd worked construction together for 15 years, back when Elliot was young, and thought he'd spend his life building houses. Gerald had called the night before Elliot left town. "You need this," Gerald had said. "Just don't stay gone too long. That girl needs her daddy." 2 weeks, Elliot had promised. "Just 2 weeks to get my head straight." But now, standing in the cabin with firelight dancing on the walls, he wasn't sure 2 weeks would be enough. The mountain had a way of making time feel different, slower. Hours passed like days, and days felt like moments. He could lose himself up here, he realized. Could let the world below fade until it felt like a dream he'd once had. On the 5th morning, he noticed the window. It was on the east side of the cabin, facing the valley. Unlike the others, which had been dirty but intact, this one was covered from the inside. Someone had nailed boards across it, thick planks hammered in with long nails, sealed tight as a coffin. He'd noticed it while cleaning, but hadn't thought much of it. Old cabins had their quirks. Maybe there'd been a broken pane, or maybe the previous owner just wanted to keep the cold out, but the more he looked at it, the stranger it seemed. The other windows were single-pane glass, old but functional. This one had been deliberately sealed and not carelessly. The boards were tight, overlapping, nailed at angles that suggested someone had taken their time. Someone had wanted this window closed and wanted it to stay that way. Elliot stood in front of it, with his coffee growing cold in his hands. Morning light filtered through the cracks between boards, thin lines of gold against the dark wood. What was on the other side that needed to be hidden? He tried to tell himself it didn't matter. The cabin was his now. He could open the window or leave it sealed. It made no difference. But curiosity gnawed at him, that same restless feeling that had driven him up the mountain in the first place. A need to know, to understand, to pull back the layers and see what lay beneath. By noon, he'd made his decision. He fetched his hammer and pry bar from the truck, set them on the floor beneath the boarded window, and stood there for a long moment, staring at the sealed wood. His father's voice echoed in his memory, words from decades ago. "Some doors are closed for a reason, son. Best to leave them that way." But Elliot had never been good at leaving things alone. He wedged the pry bar behind the first board and pulled. The first board came away with a screech of old nails, pulling free from wood. Elliot set it aside and reached for the next one. Dust motes swirled in the air, caught in the thin beams of light now streaming through the gap he'd created. The second board was more stubborn. Someone had driven the nails deep, countersinking them into the frame. He had to work the pry bar back and forth, feeling the wood groan and resist before finally giving way. 3 boards down, and he could see glass behind them. Intact glass, not broken, so it hadn't been sealed because of damage. That made it stranger still. The 4th board split as he pulled it, the wood too old and dry to hold together. The crack was loud in the quiet cabin, and Elliot paused, breathing hard. His heart was beating faster than the work warranted. Something about this felt wrong, felt like crossing a threshold he couldn't uncross. He thought about stopping, thought about nailing the boards back up and pretending he'd never started. But his hands were already reaching for the 5th board, and then the 6th, until finally the window stood bare before him. The glass was filthy, covered in decades of grime on the outside. He couldn't see through it. Elliot grabbed a rag and some water, climbed onto the windowsill, and started scrubbing. The dirt came away slowly, revealing first shapes, then details, then a view that made him go very still. The valley spread out below him, vast and beautiful. The morning sun painted everything gold. The tops of pine trees, the rocky outcroppings, the distant ridges that marched toward the horizon. It was breathtaking, the kind of view people paid fortunes to see. But that wasn't what stopped his breath in his chest. Down the slope, maybe 200 yards below the cabin, sat the ruins of another structure. He could just make out the foundation, the collapsed walls, the skeletal remains of what had once been a building. Moss and small trees had grown up through it, reclaiming it for the forest. It looked like it had been there for decades, slowly dissolving back into the earth, and rising from the center of those ruins, somehow still standing, was a weather vane. Elliot's hands started shaking. The rag fell from his fingers to the floor. He knew that weather vane, knew the shape of it, the proportions, the way the rooster sat proud on top with its tail feathers spread wide. His father had made it when Elliot was young, had spent weeks in his workshop hammering and shaping the metal, getting every detail right. It had sat atop their barn in eastern Oregon, spinning in the wind, a landmark Elliot had seen every day of his childhood. When his father left, just disappeared one night when Elliot was 17, the farm had eventually been sold. Elliot had assumed the weather vane went with it, just another piece of his father's life scattered to strangers. But here it was, on a mountain 300 miles from that farm, on land Elliot had never known existed, standing watch over ruins he'd never heard about. His legs felt weak. He sat down hard on the floor, staring at the window, at the impossible view beyond it. His mind raced through explanations and found none that made sense. His father couldn't have been here. There was no reason for him to be here. No reason for that weather vane to be spinning slowly in the mountain wind, like a ghost's beacon. Elliot didn't remember deciding to go down there. He just found himself pulling on his boots, grabbing his jacket, stepping out into the cold morning air. The slope was steep and treacherous, covered in pine needles that made his feet slip. He caught himself on tree trunks, half sliding down the incline, driven by something he couldn't name. The ruins were worse up close. What had once been a cabin, smaller than his but built in a similar style, had collapsed inward. The roof was gone entirely. 2 walls still stood partially, but the others had fallen, creating a jumble of rotted timber and rusted nails. Nature had been working on it for a long time. Ferns grew from cracks in the foundation. A young pine tree had taken root where the front door must have been. The weather vane rose from what would have been the center of the structure, mounted on a pole that had somehow remained upright through decades of weather and decay. Up close, there was no doubt. The same hammer marks on the metal, the same slightly crooked beak on the rooster, the same initials stamped into the base, W.H., his father's initials. William Huxley. Elliot felt like the ground was tilting beneath him. He grabbed the weather vane's pole to steady himself, felt the cold metal against his palm, real and solid and impossible. He started searching through the ruins. Carefully at first, then more frantically, pulling aside rotted boards, digging through layers of decomposed leaves and moss. His hands were filthy within minutes, scraped and bleeding from splinters and sharp metal edges. He didn't care. Under a collapsed section of wall he found a metal box. It was rusted but intact, about the size of a shoebox. The latch was frozen shut. Elliot had to pry it open with a rock, bending the metal, forcing it. When it finally gave way, the lid popped up with a groan. Inside were photographs. Old ones, the colors faded to pastels, the edges curled with age. Elliot pulled them out with trembling hands. The first showed a young man standing in front of this very cabin before it collapsed, when it was new and whole. The man was smiling, one hand raised to shade his eyes from the sun. Elliot recognized that smile, those eyes, that stance. It was his father, but younger than Elliot had ever known him, maybe 25 years old, lean and strong, with a full head of dark hair and a happiness in his expression that Elliot had never seen in person. The second photograph showed his father with a woman. She was beautiful in a quiet way, dark hair pulled back, a soft smile, her hand resting on his father's arm. They stood in the same spot, and the way they looked at each other made Elliot's chest ache. That was love, pure and uncomplicated. The third photograph was of his father and the woman working on the cabin. His father was on the roof, and the woman stood below, looking up at him, both of them caught mid-laugh. There were more. A dozen photographs, all from the same period, all showing his father living a life Elliot knew nothing about. The woman appeared in most of them. In some, there were other people too, an older couple, a young boy, a few other adults. They all looked happy, like they belonged together. At the bottom of the box, Elliot found something else. A brass compass, hand-carved, with intricate engravings on the casing. He opened it. The inside of the lid was engraved, "To William, may you always find your way home. Love, Dad." Elliot's grandfather had given this to his father. He remembered seeing it once, long ago, in his father's drawer. He'd asked about it, but his father had closed the drawer quickly and changed the subject. Elliot sat back on his heels, the compass in one hand and the photographs in the other. Around him, the forest was silent except for the creak of the weather vane turning in the breeze. His father had been here, had built this cabin, lived in it, loved someone in it, had a whole life that he'd never spoken of, that he'd hidden so completely Elliot never even suspected it existed. And then he'd left it all behind. Sealed the window so he'd never have to see the ruins. Walked away and built a different life with Elliot's mother, carried the secret until the day he died. Why? What had happened here? Who was the woman in the photographs? Elliot looked up at his cabin on the slope above, at the window now standing open like an accusation. His hands were shaking again, but not from cold. He gathered the photographs and the compass carefully, placed them back in the metal box, and started the climb back up the mountain. He had phone calls to make, questions to ask, a past to unbury. The cell phone signal was weak, but if Elliot stood on the porch and held his phone at just the right angle, he could sometimes get a bar or two. He tried Audrey 3 times before the call went through. "Elliot, can you hear me? You're breaking up. Audrey, I need to ask you something about Dad." Static crackled on the line. "What about him? Did he ever—" Elliot paused, searching for the right words. "Did he ever mention anything about living in the mountains? Before he met Mom?" Silence, then, "What?" "No, why would you ask that?" Elliot told her. About the window, the ruins, the weather vane, the photographs. As he spoke, he could hear his sister's breathing change, could imagine her sitting down, processing what he was saying. "That doesn't make any sense," she said finally. "Dad worked in the lumber mill. He lived in Baker City his whole life before he met Mom. That's what he always told us." "Well, he lied," Elliot said. The words felt harsh, but they were true. "He was here, Audrey. I'm holding proof in my hands. Who's the woman in the photos?" "I don't know. But they looked—" He stopped, not sure how to explain what he'd seen in their faces. "They looked like they were building a life together." Another long pause. "I don't understand. Why would he keep this from us?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out." The call dropped before they could say more. Elliot didn't try to call back. He went inside and spread the photographs across the small table, studying them in the lamplight. The woman's face haunted him. She looked so alive, so present, and his father looked different. Younger, yes, but also lighter somehow. As if a weight he'd carried for as long as Elliot had known him hadn't yet settled on his shoulders. Elliot made coffee and sat down with the metal box. He pulled everything out carefully, laying it all on the table. The photographs, the compass, some loose papers that had stuck to the bottom. One was a receipt for lumber, dated 1981. Another was a hand-drawn map of the property, marking where trees should be cleared, where a well should be dug. At the very bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small leather journal. Elliot's hands trembled as he unwrapped it. The leather was water-damaged, stiff and cracked, but the journal had been protected well enough that the pages inside were mostly intact. He opened it to the first page. The handwriting was unmistakably his father's, the same careful script Elliot remembered from birthday cards and the occasional note left on the kitchen counter. The first entry was dated March 15th, 1981. We bought the land today. 20 acres on the mountain. It's not much, but it's ours. Iris cried when I showed her the deed. Happy tears. She says we can build our whole life here. I believe her. I believe in us, Iris. The woman had a name, Elliot read on, his coffee growing cold beside him. The journal chronicled his father's life on the mountain, entry by entry, dream by dream. Building the cabin by hand, logging the measurements and challenges. The satisfaction of getting the roof up before the first snow. The pride in installing the windows, including the one that faced the valley. The best view in the world, his father had written. There were entries about Iris, how she planted a garden in the clearing, how she sang while cooking, how she made the cabin feel like home, even when it was just bare walls and a wood stove. His father's love for her poured off every page, raw and honest, in a way Elliot had never heard him speak about anything. April 22nd, 1981. Iris and I talked about names tonight. If we have a daughter, she wants to name her Rose. If a son, she likes Samuel. I don't care what we call them as long as they're healthy. As long as they grow up here, with the mountains and the trees and room to breathe. This is where we'll raise our family. This is where we belong. Elliot's throat tightened. His father had wanted children here, with this woman. Had imagined a future that never came to be. The entries continued through spring and summer. His father worked as a logger, bringing home money to buy supplies. Iris worked in the nearest town, at a diner 40 miles down the mountain. They were saving for a truck, for furniture, for solar panels so they wouldn't have to rely on generators and lamplight forever. But as the entries moved into fall, the tone began to change. September 3rd, 1981. Men came up the road today, said they were surveying for a mining company. Iris told them to leave. They didn't like that. They said the whole mountain is being assessed for mineral rights. Copper, they think. Maybe silver. They looked at our cabin like it was in their way. September 18th, 1981. More surveyors. This time they had legal papers. Said the mining company has rights to prospect on all the land in this area. I showed them our deed. They said it doesn't matter. If they find enough mineral deposits, they can force us to sell through eminent domain. I don't know what that means, but it doesn't sound good. October 2nd, 1981. Went into town to talk to a lawyer. He said we might have a fight on our hands. The mining company is big, well-funded. They've been buying up land all over the region. Some families are selling willingly. Others are being pressured. He asked how much we'd take to leave. I told him we're not leaving. This is our home. Elliot read faster, turning pages with growing unease. The entries became shorter, more anxious. His father wrote about threats, about supplies being blocked, about roads being closed without warning. Other families on the mountain were facing the same pressure. Some left. Others, like his father and Iris, refused. November 20th, 1981. Iris's family is staying. The old Hendricks place down the valley is staying. We're forming a coalition, going to fight this together. There are 7 families left who won't sell. The company is getting aggressive. Their men come around at night sometimes, just watching, trying to scare us. It's working on some folks, but not us. We have too much to lose. December 4th, 1981. Winter came hard this year. Roads are barely passable. The company men haven't been around as much. Maybe they've given up. Maybe they'll leave us alone now. Iris says we should be careful. She says men like that don't give up, they just wait. December 15th, 1981. Something's wrong. Iris is scared and won't tell me why. She says she's hearing things at night. Footsteps around the cabin. Shadows moving in the trees. I told her it's just animals, but I've been hearing them too. Tonight I'm going to sit up and keep watch. The next entry was dated a week later. The handwriting was shakier, harder to read. December 22nd, 1981. Fire. The Westfield cabin burned last night. We saw it from our window, flames against the sky. By the time we got down there, it was too late. The cabin was gone. Their son, he was only 8 years old. He didn't make it out. Iris knew him. She's not speaking, just sits and stares at nothing. Everyone knows it wasn't an accident. Everyone knows what this is, but there's no proof. The sheriff came, looked around, said it was probably a bad chimney. Nobody believes him. Elliot set the journal down. His hands were shaking. An 8-year-old boy, a family destroyed, and everyone looking the other way because a mining company wanted the land. He stood and walked to the window, the one that had been boarded up. From here, he could just make out the ruins below in the fading afternoon light. His father had stood at this very window and watched another family's home burn, had known the truth and been powerless to stop it. No wonder he'd sealed it. No wonder he'd left and never spoken of this place again. But there were still more pages in the journal, more entries, more story to uncover. Elliot returned to the table, turned to the next page, and kept reading as darkness fell around the cabin. Elliot read through the night. The fire in the stove burned low, and he fed it absently without looking away from the journal. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, but he barely heard it. December 28th, 1981. Iris hasn't been the same since the fire. She blames herself. Says if her family had just sold like the company wanted, maybe the Westfields would have too. Maybe that boy would still be alive. I tell her it's not her fault, but she won't listen. She barely eats. Barely sleeps. I don't know how to help her. January 10th, 1982. 3 more families sold out. Can't blame them. Not after what happened. It's just us, the Hendricks, and old Virgil now. 3 families holding out against a company that's already shown what they're willing to do. Iris wants to leave. Says it's not worth dying for. But this is our home. Everything we built is here. I don't know what to do. January 24th, 1982, found survey stakes on our land today. The company is still working, still planning, like we don't exist. I pulled them all up and threw them in the ravine. Childish, maybe, but it felt good. Elliot turned the page. The next few entries were brief, almost mechanical. His father wrote about chopping wood, fixing the roof, basic survival tasks. Between the lines, Elliot could feel the tension building. The weight of waiting for something terrible to happen. February 14th, 1982. It's Valentine's Day. I wanted to do something special for Iris, but she's so distant now. I made her breakfast and she barely touched it. She spends hours just looking out the window at the valley. Sometimes I catch her crying, and she won't tell me why. The woman I fell in love with is disappearing, and I don't know how to bring her back. March 2nd, 1982. She's leaving. Iris told me this morning she can't stay here anymore. Says every time she closes her eyes, she sees that boy, sees the fire. She says this mountain is cursed and we're fools for staying. I begged her to stay. Told her we could start over somewhere else, sell the land, move to town. She said it's too late. She said she needs to go away, far away, and forget this place ever existed. March 5th, 1982. She's gone. Packed her things while I was down at Virgil's place. When I came back, the cabin was empty except for a note. She wrote that she loves me, but she can't live with the guilt. She's going to her aunt's place in California. She says don't follow her. She says we both need to move on. I don't know how to move on from this. Elliot stopped reading. He pressed his palms against his eyes, feeling the ache behind them. His father had lost everything on this mountain. The woman he loved, the home he'd built, the future he'd dreamed of. He kept reading. March 20th, 1982. I should leave too. Virgil tells me there's nothing left to fight for. The company won. Most of the families are gone. But I can't make myself go. This cabin, we built it with our own hands. Every board, every nail. Walking away feels like admitting it was all for nothing. April 3rd, 1982. Haven't written in a while. Not much to say. I work, I eat. I sleep, the days blur together. Sometimes I stand at the window and look down at where the Westfield cabin used to be. The ruins are still there. Nobody's cleared them. It's like a grave marker. April 30th, 1982. Decided today that I'm leaving. Can't stay here anymore. Every corner of this place reminds me of her. I'm selling the land to the mining company, taking their money and leaving. Virgil says I'm doing the right thing. He sold out last week. Says there's no shame in knowing when you're beaten. I don't know about that. Feels like shame to me. May 15th, 1982, leaving tomorrow. Packed everything I can carry. The rest I'm leaving behind. Let the mountain have it. Let it all rot. I sealed up the east window today, the one that looks down at the ruins. I never want to see that view again. Never want to remember what happened here. The entries stopped there. The rest of the journal pages were blank. Elliot closed the book and sat in silence. His father had written nothing about where he went after leaving the mountain. Nothing about meeting Elliot's mother, starting over, building a new life. The story just ended, as if William Huxley had ceased to exist the moment he walked away from this cabin, but he hadn't ceased to exist. He'd gone on to have a family, to work, to live another 40 years. He just never spoke about the life he'd had before. Never mentioned Iris or the mountain or the dreams that died here. Elliot stood and walked to the window, the one his father had sealed. Dawn was breaking, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Below, the ruins sat quiet and still. The weather vane caught the first light, gleaming like a beacon. He thought about the property deed in the metal box. His father's name on official papers, proof of ownership. If his father had sold the land to the mining company, how had it ended up for sale again decades later? How had Elliot been able to buy it? Something didn't add up. Elliot went to his truck and retrieved his laptop. The battery was low, but he had enough charge to work for a while. He drove down the mountain until he caught a decent internet signal, then pulled over and started searching. Mining companies in the Cascades in the 1980s. There were several, but one name kept appearing, Cascade Mineral Corporation. They'd purchased mineral rights across thousands of acres in the early 80s, displaced dozens of families, started exploratory drilling. Then in 1985, they'd abandoned the project entirely. Environmental regulations had changed. The cost of extraction had become prohibitive. They'd sold off the land holdings and dissolved. Elliot searched for the property records. It took time, tracing ownership through multiple sales, but eventually he found it. The land where his cabin stood had been sold by Cascade Mineral Corporation in 1986 to a private buyer. That buyer had sold it again in 1994, then again in 2003. Each time the price had dropped. Remote mountain property with no road access and no utilities wasn't valuable. By the time Elliot bought it, the price was barely more than the cost of the land itself. But the original sale from the mining company, the one in 1986, listed the previous owner, William Huxley, so his father had sold the land. The journal was accurate, but that meant Elliot had bought back his father's property without knowing it. Some cosmic coincidence had brought him to the exact spot where his father's first life had crumbled, or maybe it wasn't. Coincidence at all? Elliot searched for information about Iris. The journal never mentioned her last name, but the photographs might help. He pulled them out and studied the background of each image. In one, there was a mailbox visible, barely legible in the faded photo. He squinted at it, could just make out what might be Morgan or Morrison. He tried searching for Iris Morgan in California, 1982. Too many results. He tried Iris Morrison. Still too many. He needed more information. Then he remembered the other families. The journal had mentioned names. The Westfields, the family whose cabin burned. The Hendricks. Virgil, who'd been his father's friend. Elliot searched for Virgil Hendricks in the mountain area. After several tries, he found something. An obituary from 2019. Virgil Hendricks, aged 89, longtime resident of the Cascade region, survived by 2 daughters and 5 grandchildren. The obituary mentioned he'd been a rancher and logger, had lived through the mining disputes of the early 1980s. The obituary listed his current address at the time of death. A ranch 40 miles from the base of the mountain. Elliot checked his phone. It was barely 6 in the morning. Too early to call anyone. Too early to show up at a stranger's door. But he was done sleeping, done waiting. He started the truck and headed toward the address, toward the next piece of the puzzle, toward whatever truth was waiting to be found. The Hendricks Ranch sat in a valley where the mountains gave way to rolling grassland. It was a working operation. Elliot could see cattle dotting the distant fields, outbuildings in good repair, a barn that looked recently painted. The main house was modest but well kept, with a wide porch and flower boxes under the windows that must have been beautiful in summer. It was nearly 8 o'clock when Elliot pulled into the drive. He sat in the truck for a moment, gathering his thoughts, rehearsing what he might say. How did you explain to strangers that you were chasing ghosts? That you'd stumbled into a past that wasn't yours, but somehow felt like it belonged to you anyway? Before he could decide, the front door opened. A woman in her 60s stepped out, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She looked at his truck with curiosity rather than suspicion. Elliot got out. "I'm sorry to bother you so early. I'm looking for the Hendricks family. I read that Virgil Hendricks passed away a few years back. He was my father," the woman said. Her voice was warm, with a hint of mountain accent. "I'm Dorothy. What can I do for you?" "My name is Elliot Huxley. I think my father knew your dad back in the early 80s. They lived on the mountain together." Dorothy's expression shifted. Recognition flickered across her face, followed by something else. Concern, maybe, or old sadness. "Huxley, William Huxley." "Yes, ma'am." She was quiet for a moment, studying him. Then she nodded. "You better come inside." The house was warm and smelled of coffee and bacon. Dorothy led him to the kitchen and poured him a cup without asking. They sat at a heavy wooden table that looked like it had been there for generations. "Your father," she said. "I was just a girl when all that happened, but I remember him. Remember your daddy and Iris. They were good people. Didn't deserve what came their way. I'm trying to understand what happened. I found my father's cabin, or what's left of it. Found his journal. But there are pieces missing." Dorothy sipped her coffee. "How much do you know?" "I know about the mining company. The fire that killed the Westfield boy. I know Iris left, and my father sold the land and left too. But I don't know what happened after. I don't know what became of Iris." Dorothy set her cup down carefully. "That's a hard story. You sure you want to hear it?" "I need to," she nodded slowly. "All right then. Let me get something first." She left the room and returned a few minutes later with a cardboard box. Inside were old photographs, newspaper clippings, documents yellowed with age. She spread them on the table. "My father never forgot what happened on that mountain," she said. "He kept all this, said it was important to remember, even when everyone else wanted to forget." She pulled out a newspaper clipping from 1982. The headline read, "Mountain Fire Claims Young Life." Below was a grainy photograph of the burned cabin, smoke still rising from the ruins. The Westfield boy's name was Timothy, Dorothy said. 8 years old. His family had been on that mountain for 3 generations. When the mining company started pressuring folks, they refused to leave. They weren't alone. There were maybe a dozen families holding out. Your father and Iris among them. The journal said it wasn't an accident. It wasn't. Everybody knew it. The company had been making threats, sending men around at night to intimidate people. 2 weeks before the fire, someone cut the Westfield's phone line. A week before, their well was contaminated. Someone dumped something in it. Then the cabin burned, and nobody did anything? Dorothy's face hardened. The sheriff was on the company's payroll. The state didn't care about a handful of mountain families. We were in the way of progress, they said. In the way of jobs and revenue. The company claimed they had nothing to do with the fire, and without proof, there was nothing anyone could do. She pulled out another clipping. This one showed Iris, younger than in the photographs Elliot had found, but unmistakably the same woman. The caption identified her as Iris Morrison, speaking at a community meeting about the mining disputes. Iris's family knew the Westfields well. Her younger brother and Timothy were friends. When the fire happened, Iris, Dorothy paused, her eyes distant. She fell apart. Blamed herself for speaking out against the company, for encouraging others to resist. She thought if they'd all just sold and left, that boy would still be alive. The journal said she left for California. She did. Broke your father's heart. He stayed for a few more weeks, but eventually he couldn't take it anymore. Sold the land to the mining company for pennies on the dollar and left. My father tried to talk him out of it, but your daddy, he was done. Said he never wanted to see the mountain again. Elliot leaned back in his chair. Did your father ever hear from him after that? Once, maybe 6 months after he left. A letter saying he'd found work in Eastern Oregon that he was trying to start over. Asked if my father had heard anything about Iris. Dad wrote back, but the letter was returned. After that, we never heard from him again. Elliot pulled the wedding ring from his pocket, the one he'd found near the ruins. He set it on the table. "I found this at the cabin site." Dorothy picked it up, turning it over in her hands. She read the engraving aloud. W.H. and I.M. She looked at Elliot with understanding in her eyes. They were going to get married. Had the rings made and everything. The wedding was supposed to be that spring, after the snow melted. But then the fire happened and... She shook her head. Love doesn't always survive tragedy. Do you know what happened to Iris? Where she went? Dorothy hesitated. My father tried to find her once, years later. Wanted to make sure she was all right. He tracked her down to a town in Northern California, Eureka, I think. But he never made contact. Said it was clear she'd built a new life, and he didn't want to drag up old pain. Is she still there? I don't know. That was 30 years ago. She could be anywhere now. Could be... Dorothy stopped herself. Could be dead, Elliot finished. Could be. Dorothy agreed gently. Or she could be living quietly somewhere, trying to forget what happened. Either way, finding her won't be easy. And even if you do, she looked at him seriously, you need to ask yourself why you're doing this. What you hope to accomplish. Sometimes the past is better left alone. Elliot thought about his father's silence, about the years of distance between them, about dying without ever explaining the weight he'd carried. My father never talked about any of this. Never told me or my sister that he'd had another life, loved another woman. I spent my whole childhood thinking he was just... He searched for the word. Cold, distant. Now I know he was just broken. We're all broken by something, Dorothy said. The question is whether digging up the pieces helps or just spreads the damage around. Elliot stood. Thank you for talking to me, for showing me all this. Dorothy walked him to the door. As he reached his truck, she called out, Elliot, if you do find Iris, be gentle with her. Whatever life she's built, she built it to survive. Don't be the one who tears it down. He nodded and drove away, the wedding ring heavy in his pocket, his mind already racing ahead to the next step. He had a name now, a possible location. He had enough to keep searching, and despite Dorothy's warning, he knew he wouldn't stop until he found the truth. All of it. Elliot drove back to the cabin through gathering clouds. Snow was coming. He could smell it in the air, taste it on the wind. He'd need to get down the mountain soon, or risk being trapped for days, maybe weeks. But first, he needed to think. The cabin felt different now. Not just empty, but inhabited by ghosts. He could imagine his father here, young and hopeful, building a life board by board. Could imagine Iris singing in the kitchen, planning their future, believing the mountain would keep them safe. Could imagine the night they'd seen the fire down the valley, watch their world begin to crumble. He made coffee and sat at the table with his laptop. The battery was running low, but he had enough charge to continue his search. Dorothy had said Eureka, Northern California. A place to start. He searched for Iris Morrison in Eureka, but the results were sparse and decades old. He tried variations of the name. Iris M. I. Morrison, searching through phone directories, property records, anything that might give him a trail to follow. Most of what he found was outdated or led nowhere. Then he tried a different approach. He searched for obituaries, marriage records, anything that might mention her. If she'd married, her last name would have changed. If she'd died, there would be a record. After an hour of searching, he found something. A marriage license from 1987, filed in Humboldt County, California. Iris Morrison to Kenneth Whitmore. It was the right age, the right location, the right time frame. 5 years after she'd left the mountain, she'd started over. Built a new life with someone else, just like his father had. Elliot searched for Iris Whitmore. This time, results appeared. Not many, but enough. A mention in a school newsletter from 1995, Iris Whitmore volunteering at an elementary school library. A property record from 2001 showing Iris Whitmore as co-owner of a house in Arcata, California, a town just north of Eureka. The trail went cold after that. No recent mentions, no social media presence, nothing to indicate where she might be now. She'd lived quietly. Left barely a footprint in the digital world. Elliot was about to close the laptop when he noticed something he'd missed before. The marriage license from 1987 listed Kenneth Whitmore's occupation as teacher. On a hunch, Elliot searched for Kenneth Whitmore in California education records. He found an obituary from 2003. Kenneth Whitmore, age 52, beloved husband and teacher, died after a brief illness. Survived by his wife, Iris, and daughter, Polly. Elliot read the line again, his heart pounding. Iris had a daughter, born when? The obituary didn't say. But if Iris had married in 1987 and her daughter was mentioned in an obituary from 2003, Polly could be anywhere from her teens to her 30s now. He searched for Polly Whitmore. The results were scattered. A graduation announcement from a California high school in 2002, a teaching credential issued in Washington State in 2008, another teacher, like her father. The most recent result was from a school district website in Washington. Polly Sutherland, 5th grade teacher at Riverside Elementary. Sutherland, she'd married and changed her name. Elliot clicked through to the school's faculty page. There was a small photograph. A woman in her early 40s, dark hair pulled back, smiling at the camera. She had Iris's eyes, Iris's gentle expression, and something else. Something in the set of her jaw, the shape of her face, that made Elliot's breath catch. She looked like his father, not dramatically, but enough that anyone who'd known William Huxley would see the resemblance. No, that wasn't possible. The timeline didn't work. Iris had left the mountain in 1982, married Kenneth Whitmore in 1987, 5 years between. Even if she'd been pregnant when she left, Elliot pulled out the journal and flipped to the last entries. March 1982. Iris had left in early March. He counted forward. 9 months would be December. If she'd been pregnant, she would have given birth in late 1982. The obituary said Kenneth Whitmore died in 2003, survived by his daughter Polly, not his biological daughter, just his daughter. And if Polly was born in 1982, she'd have been 5 years old when Iris married Kenneth in 1987. Old enough to remember a different father if she'd known one. Young enough to accept Kenneth as the only father she'd ever known if Iris had never told her otherwise. Elliot's hands were shaking. He set the laptop aside and stood, pacing the small cabin. This was speculation, desperate hope based on a resemblance in a photograph and a gap in a timeline. It couldn't be true, but what if it was? What if Iris had left the mountain not just heartbroken but pregnant? What if she'd never told his father, because she thought it would trap him, burden him, destroy whatever chance he had at a new life? What if Elliot had a half-sister he'd never known about? He called Audrey. The connection was weak, but it held. "You sound out of breath," she said. "What's wrong?" "I think Dad had another child." Silence. "Then what are you talking about?" He told her everything he'd found. The timeline, the resemblance, the way the pieces seemed to fit together. Audrey listened without interrupting. "That's a lot of guessing," she said finally. "You don't know for sure." "I know. But what if I'm right? Then you have a sister you've never met, and she has a brother she doesn't know exists. And somewhere out there, Iris, if she's even still alive, has been keeping that secret for 40 years. Audrey's voice was careful, measured. "Elliot, you need to be sure before you go knocking on doors and turning people's lives upside down." "How do I be sure?" "I don't know. Birth records, maybe? Can you find Polly's birth certificate? Those records are sealed unless you're family. You might be family. That's the whole question." Elliot sat down heavily. "I can't just show up at her school and say, 'Hi, I think we might be related because I found our father's cabin and he never told anyone about it.' That's insane. So hire someone. A private investigator. Someone who knows how to find records and make contact without causing damage." It made sense. It was the careful, reasonable thing to do. But every part of Elliot wanted to drive to Washington, find this woman, look her in the eye, and see if the resemblance he'd noticed in a photograph was real. "I'll think about it," he said. "Think fast. Sophie's supposed to come up there this weekend, remember? Storm's coming and you need to get off that mountain before you're snowed in." Sophie. He'd almost forgotten. In 3 days, his daughter was supposed to visit, supposed to see the cabin he'd been fixing up. She'd called twice this week, excited to spend time with him, to explore the mountain. He couldn't cancel on her again. "You're right," he said. "I'll come down tomorrow." Deal with this from town. Good. And Elliot, be careful with this. If you're right about Polly, if she really is Dad's daughter, think about what that means. She's lived her whole life not knowing. Finding out might not be the gift you think it is. After they hung up, Elliot stood at the window, the one his father had sealed. The clouds had moved in, turning the sky iron grey. The first snowflakes were starting to fall, drifting down like ash. Down in the valley, the ruins sat quiet. The weather vane turned in the wind, catching the fading light. His father had built that, had hammered the metal, shaped the rooster, mounted it with pride. Then he'd walked away and never looked back, carrying secrets that had shaped everything that came after. Elliot thought about Sophie, about the life they'd built together after her mother died, about the things he'd kept from her, not secrets exactly, but shadows of grief he tried to hide so she wouldn't have to carry them too. Was that what his father had done? Tried to protect his family by burying the past so deep it couldn't hurt them? But it had hurt them anyway. The silence had hurt. The distance had hurt. And now, decades later, Elliot was standing in the ruins of that silence, trying to piece together what had been lost. Tomorrow, he'd leave the mountain. He'd go back to Sophie, spend time with his daughter, be the father she needed. But this wasn't over. He'd find Iris or Polly or whoever could help him understand the truth. He'd uncover what his father had buried, because some things couldn't stay hidden forever. Some ghosts demanded to be seen. The snow fell harder through the night. By morning, the world was white and silent. Elliot looked out at his truck and knew he wasn't going anywhere. The roads would be impassable for days. He called Audrey to let her know. She was disappointed but understanding. "Just stay safe up there. Sophie will be fine with me until you can get down. Tell her I'm sorry. She knows." And Elliot, use the time. You've got all those records, that journal. Maybe there's something you missed. After they hung up, Elliot did exactly that. He went through everything again. Every photograph, every journal entry, every scrap of paper from the metal box. He studied his father's handwriting, looking for clues in the words left unsaid. He examined the photographs, searching for details he might have overlooked. One photo kept drawing his attention. It showed his father and Iris standing in front of the cabin in what looked like late fall or early winter. Trees bare in the background, both of them wearing heavy coats. Iris's coat was bulky, but something about the way it hung suggested there might be a reason beyond the weather. Could she have been pregnant in this photo? It was impossible to tell for certain. The coat obscured everything. But the more Elliot looked, the more convinced he became. The way she stood, one hand resting low on her abdomen, the protective curve of her posture. The caption on the back in his father's handwriting, November 1981, our last good day, last good day. Because the fire happened in December. Because everything fell apart. But maybe also the last day before she knew, before everything changed. Elliot set the photo aside and returned to the ruins. The snow made the descent treacherous, but he moved carefully, following the same path he'd taken before. He needed to search more thoroughly. If there were answers, they might still be buried down there. The weather vane looked stark against the white sky, the iron rooster standing sentinel over the collapsed remains. Elliot began digging through the snow, through the debris, more systematically this time. He worked section by section, clearing away what had accumulated over decades. In what had been the bedroom, he could tell by the remnants of a doorframe, he found something he'd missed before. A loose board in what remained of the wall. Behind it, a small space, a hiding place. His fingers were numb with cold as he pulled the board free. Inside the hollow was a waterproof pouch, similar to the one that had protected the journal. His heart hammered as he opened it. Inside was a letter. The paper was yellowed but intact, protected all these years in its sealed container. The envelope was addressed to William Huxley, but it had never been mailed. The return address showed Iris Morrison, with a post office box in Eureka, California. The date on the postmark, or rather, where a postmark would have been if it had been sent, was written in pencil, May 1985. 3 years after she'd left. Elliot's hands shook as he unfolded the letter. The handwriting was delicate, careful, each word chosen with precision. "My dearest William," it began, "I hope this letter finds you, though I know you may never receive it. I've written it a dozen times and torn it up just as many. But I need to say these things, even if you never read them. Even if I never find the courage to send them to you. I left the mountain 3 years ago. I told myself it was the right thing to do, the only thing I could do after what happened. The guilt was eating me alive, and I thought distance would make it better. I thought if I went far enough away, I could forget, but I haven't forgotten. I think about you every day, about the cabin we built, about the life we planned, about the future we were supposed to have together. And I think about our daughter. I was pregnant when I left, William. I know I should have told you. I know you had a right to know. But I was so broken, and you were trying so hard to hold everything together, and I thought it would be easier if I just went away, if I made the choice for both of us. Her name is Polly. She was born on December 18th, 1982. She has your eyes and your quiet way of looking at the world. She's beautiful and perfect. And every time I look at her, I see us, what we could have been. I've tried to give her a good life. I work at a diner, and I have a small apartment. It's not the mountain, not the dream we had, but it's safe. She's safe. That's what matters. I heard through old friends that you left the mountain too, that you sold the land and moved on. I hope you found happiness, William. I hope you found someone who could give you what I couldn't. Peace, a future without ghosts. I'm writing this letter because I want to leave it at the cabin, or what's left of it. I drove up last week just to see it one more time. The place is ruins now, reclaimed by the forest. But I felt close to you there, close to who we used to be. If you ever come back, if you ever want to know about your daughter, I've hidden this letter where we used to hide notes for each other. Behind the loose board in the bedroom wall. Do you remember? You found it when you were building, and we decided it would be our secret place. She's 3 years old now, William. She asks about her father sometimes, and I don't know what to tell her. Someday I'll have to explain. Someday she'll deserve the truth. But not yet. Not while the pain is still so fresh. I don't expect you to come looking for this letter. I don't expect anything. I just needed to tell you, even if you never know. You have a daughter. Her name is Polly, and she's the best thing I've ever done. I will always love you. That hasn't changed. But I also know that sometimes love isn't enough to overcome what the world does to us. Take care of yourself wherever you are. Be happy. Live the life we couldn't have together. With all my heart, Iris. Elliot read the letter 3 times, tears freezing on his cheeks. His father had a daughter. Elliot had a sister. And Iris had carried this secret for years, waiting for his father to come back and find the truth she'd left for him. But had he? The journal said he'd sealed the window in May 1982, but this letter was dated 1985. Had his father returned to the mountain after that? Elliot thought about the careful way the window had been boarded, the deliberate sealing, the overlapping boards. That wasn't the work of someone doing a quick job. That was someone who wanted to make sure they never saw something again. Had his father found this letter? Had he learned about Polly and made the choice to walk away? Or had he sealed the window before Iris ever left the letter, never knowing his daughter existed? There was only one way to find out. He had to find Polly. He had to tell her the truth her mother had hidden in a mountain ruin 40 years ago. The snow continued to fall, but Elliot barely noticed. He climbed back to the cabin, the letter clutched in his frozen hands, and began planning what he would do the moment the roads cleared. He would find his sister, and together they would uncover the rest of the truth. The storm cleared after 3 days. Elliot spent those days preparing, not just for the drive down, but for what came next. He photographed every page of the journal, every document, every photograph. He handled Iris's letter with careful reverence, sealing it in a protective sleeve. These weren't just artifacts anymore. They were proof of a life his sister had never known she had. When the roads finally opened, he drove straight through to town. Sophie was waiting at Audrey's house, bouncing with excitement when she saw his truck pull up. She ran out before he'd even turned off the engine. "Dad, I thought you'd never come back." He caught her in his arms, held her tight. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. The snow had me trapped. Aunt Audrey said you found something important up there. Something about Grandpa. Elliot looked over Sophie's head at his sister, who stood in the doorway. Audrey gave him a small nod. She'd prepared Sophie, at least a little. I did find something. Something big. But I need to take care of a few things first, and then I'll tell you all about it. Deal? Deal. But can I come to the cabin next time, please? Absolutely, I promise. That evening, after Sophie was asleep, Elliot and Audrey sat at her kitchen table. He showed her everything. The letter, the photographs, the timeline he'd pieced together. So what are you going to do? Audrey asked. I'm going to find her. I hired an investigator. She's working on getting Polly's birth certificate, confirming the details. If everything checks out, I'm going to contact her. And say what? Exactly? Elliot had thought about this for 3 days. The truth, that I'm her brother, that our father never knew about her, or if he did, he chose not to act, that her mother tried to tell him, but left the message where he might never find it. That's a lot to drop on someone. I know. But she deserves to know. And he paused, searching for the right words. I want to know her. She's family, the only family Dad left behind besides us. Audrey was quiet for a moment. What if she doesn't want to be found? What if she's happy not knowing? Then I'll respect that. But I have to try. The investigator called 2 days later. Her name was Patricia, and she was efficient and direct. I found the birth certificate, she said. Polly Morrison, born December 18, 1982, in Eureka, California. Mother listed as Iris Morrison. Father listed as unknown. Unknown, Elliot repeated. So Iris had kept the secret even on official documents. I also found current contact information. Polly Sutherland, residing in Bellingham, Washington. Married, 2 children, teaches 5th grade at Riverside Elementary. By all accounts, she has a stable, happy life. Does she know she was adopted? I can't confirm that from records alone, but Kenneth Whitmore, the man who raised her, his name isn't on her birth certificate. Iris married him when Polly was 5. It's likely Polly knows Kenneth wasn't her biological father, but whether she knows anything beyond that is unclear. So what do I do? Patricia's voice softened. That's up to you. I can facilitate contact if you want. Send a letter on your behalf. Fill out the situation before you make direct contact. Or you can reach out yourself. But Mr. Huxley, be prepared for any reaction. This kind of news changes people's understanding of who they are. Elliot thought about it for a long moment. Send a letter, explain who I am, what I found, give her the choice to respond or not. I'll draft something and send it to you for approval. The letter took a week to compose. Elliot must have rewritten it 20 times, trying to find the balance between honesty and gentleness. Finally, he settled on something simple. Dear Polly, my name is Elliot Huxley. I'm writing to you because I believe we share a father, William Huxley. I recently purchased a cabin in the Cascade Mountains and discovered evidence of my father's life there in the early 1980s, including a letter from your mother, Iris Morrison. I understand this may come as a shock, and I want you to know I'm not reaching out with any expectations. I simply felt you deserved to know the truth about your father and the circumstances that separated him from you and your mother. If you're willing, I would like to share what I've found and perhaps meet you. I have documents, photographs, and your mother's own words that explain what happened all those years ago. Please know that I respect your privacy and your life. If you prefer not to respond, I will understand completely. With sincere regards, Elliot Huxley. He included his phone number and email address, then sent it to Patricia, who mailed it from her office. 2 weeks passed. Elliot tried to stay busy, taking Sophie up to the cabin for a weekend, showing her the mountain, the view from the window. He didn't tell her about the ruins yet, about Polly. That would come later, after he knew how Polly would respond. Sophie loved the cabin. She explored every corner, asked about his repairs, helped him stack firewood. At night they sat by the stove, and he told her stories about growing up with her grandfather. The parts he knew anyway, the parts that weren't hidden. He was quiet, Sophie observed. Like you. Yeah, like me. Do you think that's why you came up here? Because it was his place first? Elliot looked at his daughter, surprised by her perception. Maybe. I didn't know it was his when I bought it, but maybe some part of me knew I needed to be here. On a Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after he'd sent the letter, his phone rang. Unknown number, Washington area code. His heart stopped. He stepped outside, away from the noise of the job site where he was working. "Hello? Is this Elliot Huxley?" A woman's voice, cautious but steady. "Yes, is this?" "It's Polly, I got your letter." Elliot sat down on a stack of lumber, his legs suddenly weak. "Thank you for calling. I wasn't sure you would. I almost didn't. I've been carrying your letter around for a week, trying to decide what to do." She paused. "My mother died when I was 12. Cancer. She never told me anything about my biological father except that he was a good man who didn't know I existed. I've spent my whole life wondering." "I can tell you about him," Elliot said quietly. "Everything I know. And I can show you the letter your mother left for him. She loved you both very much." There was a long silence. Then, "Can we meet?" They agreed to meet at the cabin. Polly said she wanted to see the place where her mother and father had built their dreams, where her own story had begun. She would drive down with her husband Trevor the following weekend. Elliot spent those days preparing. He cleaned the cabin more thoroughly than he had before, fixed the porch railing, stocked the kitchen with coffee and food. He organized all the artifacts, the photographs, the journal, the compass, the wedding ring, and most importantly, Iris's letter, into a careful display on the table. He told Sophie everything. They sat together on the cabin's porch as the sun set over the valley, and he explained about their grandfather's first life, about Iris and the tragedy that had torn them apart, about the sister he'd discovered. "So I have an aunt I've never met?" Sophie asked, her eyes wide. "You do, and she has 2 kids, your cousins. Are they nice?" Elliot smiled. "I don't know yet, but I hope so. When do I get to meet them?" "Soon. Let me talk to Polly first, make sure she's comfortable with all this. It's a lot for her to process." Sophie nodded seriously. Then she said, "Dad, I think Grandpa would be glad you found her, even if he couldn't." The words settled something in Elliot's chest. "I hope you're right." The days passed slowly. Elliot found himself checking the road constantly, rehearsing what he might say, wondering if Polly would see their father in his face the way he'd seen their father in hers through that photograph. He wondered if she'd be angry that their father had never come looking, or if she'd understand the impossible weight of the choices he'd faced. Audrey called every evening to check on him. "You're overthinking this," she said on Thursday night. "I know, I can't help it. She already said yes to meeting you. That's the hardest part. The rest is just being human together. What if she hates him? What if learning the truth makes everything worse for her? Then you'll deal with that together." "But Elliot, you're giving her something she's wanted her whole life. Answers. That's a gift, even if the answers are complicated." Saturday arrived cold and clear. Elliot woke before dawn, too anxious to sleep. He made coffee, checked the cabin. One more time, straightened the photographs on the table for the 10th time. Sophie watched him pace with amusement. "You're making me nervous," she said. "Sorry, what if this is a mistake?" "It's not. You found her for a reason. Grandpa wanted you to find her, even if he didn't know it." "How can you be so sure?" Sophie shrugged. "Because you wouldn't have found the cabin otherwise. You wouldn't have opened that window. Sometimes things happen the way they're supposed to, even if it takes a long time." At 10 o'clock, Elliot saw the car coming up the mountain road from the cabin window, his heart racing as it grew closer. When it finally pulled into the clearing, he stepped out onto the porch, Sophie beside him, suddenly uncertain what to do with his hands. The passenger door opened. A woman emerged, and Elliot's breath caught. She looked so much like the photographs of Iris, it was startling. The same gentle features, the same cautious way of moving. But in her face he also saw his father unmistakably. The shape of her jaw, the set of her eyes, the way she stood as if weighing her surroundings before committing to movement. It was like looking at a photograph of his father and Iris merged into one person. A man got out from the driver's side, tall and steady, his hand finding Polly's as they walked toward the cabin. "Elliot!" Polly's voice was soft, questioning. "Polly!" He came down the steps. They stood facing each other, two strangers bound by blood and history neither had known existed until recently. Then awkwardly at first they embraced. "I can't believe this is real," she whispered. "Neither can I." They pulled apart. Polly wiped her eyes, then noticed Sophie standing on the porch. "And you must be Sophie." Sophie came forward shyly. "Hi, I guess you're my aunt?" Polly laughed through her tears. "I guess I am. That's going to take some getting used to." "This is my husband, Trevor," Polly said, turning to the man beside her. Trevor shook Elliot's hand firmly. "Thank you for finding her, for telling her the truth. She's been searching for this her whole life without knowing where to look." They went inside. The cabin felt smaller with 4 people in it, but warmer too. Elliot had coffee ready, and they sat around the table, the same table where his father had once sat, planning a future that never came to be. "This is everything I found," Elliot said, gesturing to the artifacts spread across the surface. "I wanted you to see it all, make sense of it yourself. Your mother's letter is here, and your father's journal, and all the photographs I discovered. It's your history as much as mine." Polly reached for the photographs first. Her hands trembled as she lifted each one, studying the faces of parents she'd never known together. When she found the one of Iris and William laughing, both of them caught in a moment of pure joy, she made a small sound, half sob, half wonder. "She looks so happy," Polly said. "I never saw her look like that. Not in any picture I have of her. She was always sad, isn't the right word. Wistful, maybe. Like she was looking at something beautiful that she couldn't quite reach." "They were building something here," Elliot said gently, "before everything fell apart." Sophie poured coffee for everyone, moving quietly, sensing the weight of the moment. Elliot was grateful for her presence, for the way she instinctively understood when to help and when to simply be still. He told Polly the story then, everything he'd learned. He started with buying the cabin, finding the boarded window, discovering the ruins below. He told her about the weather vane, about the journal entries that chronicled her parents' love and their dreams. He explained about the mining company, the pressure on the families, the fire that killed the Westfield boy. Polly listened without interrupting, tears streaming down her face. Trevor kept one hand on her shoulder, anchoring her through each revelation. Elliot told her how Iris had blamed herself, how the guilt had driven her away from the mountain and from the man she loved, how she'd been pregnant when she left, but carried that secret alone, trying to protect everyone, even as it tore her apart. When Elliot finished, he slid the letter across the table, her mother's words, preserved all these years in their hidden place, waiting for someone to find them. Polly picked it up with reverent care. She read it slowly, her lips moving slightly as she absorbed each sentence, each confession, each expression of love and regret. When she finished, she set it down carefully and looked up at Elliot with red-rimmed eyes. "She left this for him to find," Polly said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But he never came back." "I don't know for certain," Elliot admitted. "The journal ends with him leaving in 1982. But your mother left this letter in 1985. There's a gap, 3 years where I don't know what he did or where he was. 3 years of his life that's just blank. When did he meet your mother?" "Late 1982, from what I understand. They married in 1983. I was born in 1984. Audrey came 2 years after that." Polly processed this information, her mind clearly working through the timeline. So if he did come back and find this letter, it would have been after he'd already started a new family, after you were born. "Yes. And he would have had to choose," she said quietly, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Between the life he'd built and the daughter he didn't know existed. Between your mother and mine. Between you and me." They sat in silence for a long moment, both imagining that impossible choice. The weight of it hung in the air between them, not accusatory, but heavy with understanding. Finally, Polly spoke again, her voice steadier now. "I need to see it. The place where they lived. Where She paused, searching for words. "Where I was conceived, I suppose. Where their story began." Elliot nodded. "I'll take you there. It's a steep walk down, but the path is manageable." Sophie stood. I'll stay here. This is something you two should do together. They bundled into coats and headed outside. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and distant snow. Elliot led the way down the slope, moving carefully through the pine needles and loose stone, pointing out places to step, warning about hidden roots. Trevor followed close behind Polly, ready to catch her if she stumbled. The weather vane came into view first, rising above the tree line like a beacon from another time. It turned slowly in the mountain breeze, the metal catching the sunlight. Polly stopped when she saw it, one hand pressed to her chest. He made that, Elliot said, stopping beside her, with his own hands. It was on our family's barn when I was growing up. I saw it every day and never knew he'd brought it here first, that it meant something more than just decoration. It's beautiful, Polly whispered. The detail in the feathers, the way it's balanced. You can tell he cared about getting it right. They continued down. The ruins spread before them, softened by moss and time. What had once been walls were now just suggestions of structure, boundaries between what had been home and what was wilderness. A young pine tree grew where the front door must have been. Ferns sprouted from cracks in the foundation. Nature had been kind in its reclamation, turning tragedy into something almost peaceful. Polly walked through the space slowly, Trevor staying close behind her. She touched the remnants of the doorframe with careful fingers, traced her hand along a windowsill that had somehow survived decades of weather. She knelt beside what might have been the hearth, running her palm over the stones. They cooked meals here, she said, more to herself than anyone else. They sat by this fire and talked about their day. They made plans and dreamed about the future, about me, a baby they wanted to raise in this place. Elliot pulled the wedding ring from his pocket, the one he'd found on his first visit to the ruins. I found this near the foundation, half buried in the soil. It was meant for your mother. Polly took it with trembling hands, reading the engraving through fresh tears. W.H. and I.M. She turned it over, studying every detail. They had rings made. They were going to get married. The journal mentioned a spring wedding, after the snow melted. But then the fire happened, and everything changed. Polly slipped the ring onto her thumb, the only finger it came close to fitting. She never wore it. Never got the chance to be his wife, to have that moment. She carried me and raised me alone, and she never got to wear the ring he bought her. She loved him, Elliot said. That much is clear from everything I found. The letter, the photographs, the way other people talked about them. And he loved her just as much. What happened here, the fire, the fear, the guilt, it destroyed them both. But not the love. That stayed, even after everything else fell apart. Polly sat down on a large stone that might have once been part of the fireplace. Trevor sat beside her, and Elliot gave them space, walking to where the weather vane stood. Up close, he could see his father's craftsmanship in every detail. The careful shaping of the metal, the precise welding at the joints, the hand-filed edges. His father had been a man who built things to last, who put care into his work even when no one else would notice. I've been thinking about what you said earlier, Polly called over. About not knowing if he found the letter. Elliot turned back to her, waiting. I think he did, she continued, her voice carrying across the ruins. I think he came back, found it, and made a choice. Maybe the hardest choice of his life. What makes you think that? Polly stood walking toward him. Because if he never found it, why seal the window? Why board it up so carefully that you had to pry it apart, board by board? If he'd just left in 1982 and never come back, the window would have been left open, or broken by weather, or covered by whoever bought the property next. But he sealed it deliberately. He took time to do it right, to make sure it stayed closed. He was hiding something he couldn't bear to see. Elliot considered this. She was right. The window had been sealed with intention, with finality, each board overlapping, each nail driven deep. That was the work of someone who wanted to make sure they'd never have to look again. So he knew about you. I think so, and I think he made the only choice he could make at that point. He had a new wife, a baby on the way, you. Coming back into my mother's life, trying to be part of mine, it would have destroyed everything again. Different people this time, but the same kind of destruction. He would have torn apart two families instead of one. Are you angry? Elliot asked quietly. That he didn't choose you? Polly was silent for a long time, looking out over the valley. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermal currents. Finally, she shook her head. No, I'm not angry. I'm sad. Sad for him, for my mother, for all of us who grew up with pieces of the story missing. Sad that he carried this weight alone, that he couldn't tell anyone. But angry? No. He did what he thought was right with the information he had and the impossible situation he was in. Trevor spoke, his voice gentle. Polly's spent her whole life wondering about her father. Who he was, why he wasn't there, if he would have loved her. Now she knows. He was a good man, caught in impossible circumstances, who made an impossible choice. That's more than a lot of people get. Elliot walked back to them. I made something for you. I wanted to wait until we were here to give it to you. He pulled out a leather-bound photo album he'd assembled over the past week. Copies of all the photographs. Carefully reproduced pages from the journal. Documents from the property records, maps of the mountain. Each page was labeled with dates and context, telling the story in chronological order. It's your history. Everything I found. Everything that proves where you came from, and how much you were wanted, even if things didn't work out the way anyone hoped. I thought you should have it. Polly took the album with shaking hands. She opened it slowly and her breath caught. The first page showed her parents young and hopeful, standing in front of the cabin when it was new. Her mother's hand rested on her father's arm, both of them squinting into the sun, both of them smiling like they believed the future was theirs to shape. Thank you, Polly managed, her voice breaking. Thank you for finding this, for finding me, for caring enough to track down a stranger and tell her the truth, even when it would have been easier to keep the secret buried. You're not a stranger, Elliot said firmly. You're family. That matters. It's always mattered, even when none of us knew you existed. They sat together among the ruins as the afternoon light slanted through the pines, three people bound by loss and discovery. Below them, the valley stretched endless and beautiful. The same view their father had loved and feared and finally hidden away. Above them, the weather vane turned, catching the sun like a promise finally kept after 40 years of waiting. After a while, Polly stood, brushing dirt from her jeans. Can we go back to the cabin? I'd like to see where you live now, where you're building your life. I want to know my brother, not just the ghosts that brought us together. I'd like that, Elliot said. They climbed back up the slope, leaving the ruins to their peace. But something fundamental had shifted. The past was no longer hidden, no longer a weight pressing down on all of them. It was simply history now, known, acknowledged, integrated into who they were and who they might become together. Spring came slowly to the mountain, the way it always did at that elevation. Snow melted into streams that carved new paths down the slopes, finding their way to the valley below. Green shoots pushed through the forest floor, and the aspens began to show the first hint of leaves. The cabin, which had felt haunted by silence when Elliot first arrived, now felt alive with possibility and purpose. Polly visited 3 more times that winter and into spring, sometimes with Trevor and her children, sometimes alone when she needed time to process everything she'd learned. She and Elliot spent hours talking, filling in the gaps of their separate childhoods, discovering the ways their father's silence had shaped them both in different but parallel ways. They were different people. She was warmer, more open, quicker to laugh and share her feelings, while Elliot remained quiet and measured, more comfortable with action than words. But they recognized each other in ways that went deeper than personality, in the set of their shoulders and the way they approached problems and the particular quality of their silences. Sophie adored her new aunt from the first meeting. The two of them would walk the mountain trails together, Polly telling stories about being a teacher and the funny things her students said. Sophie sharing her dreams of becoming a veterinarian and working with wild animals. When Polly brought her children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 6, the cousins bonded quickly, the way children do when adults give them permission to belong to each other without explanation or justification. One afternoon in late April, with the mountain finally released from winter's grip, Elliot stood on a ladder, securing the restored weather vane to the cabin's roof. He'd spent weeks working on it in his workshop back in town, cleaning away decades of rust, repairing the damaged joints where weather had weakened the metal, treating everything with protective coating, restoring the rooster to something close to its original glory. Now it gleamed in the spring sunlight, ready to take its place once more. Polly stood below, one hand steadying the ladder. "You sure about this? It's been through a lot. Might not survive another 40 years up there." "That's exactly why it belongs here," Elliot said, positioning the base carefully on the mounting bracket he'd installed. "It survived everything that tried to destroy it. The fire, the mining company, decades of weather being abandoned and forgotten. It deserves to stand proud again." He tightened the final bolt and climbed down carefully. They stood together in the clearing, necks craned back, watching as a gust of wind caught the vane and set it spinning. The rooster turned smoothly on its axis, pointing first north, then east, then south, finding its purpose again after so many years of standing still among the ruins. "He'd be glad it's still standing," Polly said softly, shading her eyes against the sun. "I think so too. I think he'd be glad about a lot of things, if he could see all this." Audrey had driven up for the day, her car loaded with food and wine for what she'd insisted on calling a proper family gathering. She emerged from the cabin now, wiping her hands on a towel. "That looks perfect up there, like it was always meant to be on this cabin instead of the one below." "Maybe it was," Polly said. "Maybe everything that happened was leading to this, all of us here together." Audrey had taken to Polly immediately, delighted to have another sister and fascinated by the story that had brought them together. She set the table on the porch while Sophie and Polly's children played in the clearing, their laughter echoing off the surrounding pines. Trevor started a fire in the outdoor pit Elliot had built from stones gathered around the property. And soon the smell of wood smoke mixed with the scent of the food Audrey was preparing. As the sun lowered toward the western ridge, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, they gathered around the table. It was simple food: roasted chicken that Audrey had prepared at home and reheated, fresh bread from the bakery in town, vegetables from her garden that she'd preserved last fall, a salad made from the first spring greens. But it tasted like celebration, like family, like something worth the long journey to reach. "I want to say something," Polly said, standing with her glass of wine raised. Everyone quieted, the children sensing the importance of the moment. "6 months ago, I didn't know any of you existed. My family was small, just Trevor and the kids, a few cousins I barely see, memories of a mother who died too young and a stepfather who did his best but wasn't mine by blood. I thought that was all I'd ever have. Now," her voice caught and she paused to collect herself. "Now I have a brother, a sister, a niece and nephew. I have history and roots and people who understand where I come from without me having to explain. Elliot, you gave me that. You didn't have to search for me. You could have kept the secret buried, could have left the past alone. Nobody would have blamed you, but you didn't. You cared enough to find me, to tell me the truth even when it was hard. Thank you. Thank you for giving me the family I always wanted but never thought I'd have." Elliot stood, uncomfortable with attention as always, but knowing this moment mattered, that it needed to be marked. Dad spent his whole life carrying weight he thought he had to bear alone. He never told us about this place, about Iris, about you, Polly. I think he believed he was protecting us, protecting everyone. But secrets don't protect. They just make the weight heavier, make the burden harder to carry. They isolate us from the people who could help us bear it. He looked around the table at these faces he'd come to love, his sisters, his daughter Trevor and the children, all of them connected now by threads of discovered history. "I'm glad we don't have to carry it anymore. I'm glad the truth is out and we can build something new on top of it." They drank, and the conversation flowed easier after that. Stories were shared back and forth across the table. Audrey telling Polly about their father in his later years, the way he'd grown more withdrawn as he aged, as if the weight was finally becoming too much. Polly sharing memories of her mother, the way Iris would sometimes stare out windows for hours, especially in winter, especially when it snowed. How she'd never talked about Polly's father, but had kept one photograph hidden in a drawer. A photo of a young man standing in front of a mountain cabin that Polly now recognized as this very place. The children played until they were exhausted, then curled up on blankets near the fire. Sophie sat with her cousins, telling them stories about the mountain, about the wildlife she'd seen, about her plans to come up every weekend once school let out for summer. As darkness fell and stars emerged in the vast sky above them, brilliant and uncountable this far from any city lights, Elliot found himself thinking about the journey that had brought him here. He'd come to the mountain alone, grieving his wife, exhausted from trying to be everything Sophie needed, searching for silence and escape. Instead, he'd found voices from the past calling him toward connection, toward family, toward the complicated truth of where he came from. Later, after everyone had gone inside, Trevor and Polly taking the small bedroom, Audrey and the children arranging sleeping bags in the main room, Sophie claiming her usual spot in the loft, Elliot stood at the window. The window his father had sealed, the one he'd opened that first week, without knowing what it would reveal through the glass. He could see the valley below, the ruins barely visible in the starlight, but there nonetheless, part of the landscape now instead of something to be hidden. The weather vane on the roof creaked softly above him, turning in the night breeze, its shadow crossing the moonlit clearing. He thought about his father standing in this same spot decades ago, young and heartbroken, making the choice to hammer boards across the view he couldn't bear to see. He thought about all the years William Huxley had carried his grief silently, building a new life, while the old one remained buried on this mountain, sealed away behind wood and nails, and the determination to never look back. "I found her, Dad," Elliot whispered to the darkness, to the mountain, to whatever remained of his father in this place. "I found your daughter, and she's wonderful, kind and strong, and exactly the kind of person you would have been proud to know. I wish you could have known her. I wish you'd found the courage to come back, to be part of her life. But I understand why you didn't. I understand the weight you carried and the impossible choice you had to make." Behind him, he heard soft footsteps. Sophie appeared at his side, wrapped in a blanket, sleepy-eyed but drawn by some instinct to where her father stood. "Can't sleep?" she asked. "Just thinking about Grandpa." "Yeah." Sophie leaned against him, and he put his arm around her shoulders. Through the window, the first hint of dawn was beginning to touch the eastern ridge, turning the sky from black to deep blue. "Do you think he'd be happy about all of us being together like this?" Elliot considered the question carefully. "I think he'd be relieved. I think he spent his whole life wishing things had been different, wishing he could have made different choices. Now maybe they finally are different. Maybe we're finishing what he couldn't." "I like having Aunt Polly around," Sophie said. "And Audrey too, but we've always had her. Polly feels like a gift we didn't know we were going to get." "That's exactly what she is. I like it here," Sophie continued. "I like the mountain and the cabin and how we're not so alone anymore. When Mom died, it felt like our family got so small, like it was just you and me against everything. But now we're bigger," Elliot finished. "Now there are more of us." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching as dawn painted the valley in shades of gold and pink. The weather vane turned above them, catching the first light, and somewhere in the forest a bird began its morning song, soon joined by others until the mountain was alive with sound. The past was still there, written in ruins and weathered metal and faded photographs. But it was no longer buried, no longer hidden behind boarded windows and decades of silence. It was part of them now, acknowledged, honored, integrated into the story of who they were and who they might become. Elliot had come to the mountain searching for peace. Instead, he'd found family, connection, and the complicated truth that sometimes the hardest thing in life is knowing where you belong. But standing here now, with his daughter beside him, and his sisters sleeping safely inside, with the mountain waking around them and the weather vane turning overhead, he finally had his answer. He belonged here. They all did. This was home,